Okay, let's get right into it. We've all heard the stories about China's social credit system, right? This idea of a single score that tracks your every move. Well, today we're going to pull back that curtain. We're going to unpack what's actually true, what's a total myth, and what the far more interesting and messy reality looks like. So first, let's talk about the version of the story that just completely exploded in the West. You know the one, the all-seeing digital dystopia. And it really all kicked off with one article, way back in 2015. And this is how it was framed from the get-go. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, put out this piece that described a system punishing everything from something small, like jaywalking, to something huge, like criticizing the government. It was the perfect, terrifying picture of a high-tech police state. And this timeline, wow, it shows a classic media game of telephone. You have the speculative article written by someone who wasn't an expert, which was then republished and amplified in a matter of days. And even though the original author tried to walk it back a bit, it was too late. The story was out there and it was spreading like wildfire. And this just goes to show how powerful that narrative became. It literally went from a blog post all the way to the White House, where it was presented as cold, hard fact. And that's what really cemented the myth in the public's mind, this idea that China had one single, all-seeing system controlling its people. Okay, but here's where the story takes a really sharp turn. What happens when you actually go to China, when you're on the ground, and you ask people about this supposedly all-powerful system? Seriously, if you do this, you're probably not going to hear scary stories about government overreach. You won't hear about people nervously checking their social score after a trip to the grocery store. Nope. You're going to get a very, very different reaction. And that confusion, that's the key right there. I mean, think about it. For a system of social control to actually work, people have to know about it, right? They need to know the rules to follow them. But the most common response you get from people living in China isn't fear, it's just confusion. And that is the big reality check. That single, unified score that governs every part of your life, the one that became this huge global story, it was never real. The truth is way more complicated, and honestly, it tells us a lot more about how China's government, and frankly our own media, really work. So if it's not one big, scary system, then what is it? Well, that 2014 government plan wasn't a blueprint for a single project. The term social credit was really just shorthand for three totally different, pretty messy, and mostly separate initiatives. So what we're actually looking at are three completely different things. You've got a private financial experiment run by tech companies, you've got a bunch of chaotic local reputation systems, and you've got a national project to create government blacklists. Three separate things, all just lumped under one name. Okay, so project number one was all about money. At the time, a staggering 80% of people in China didn't have a regular credit report. The government needed to get this huge chunk of the population to start taking out loans and spending money to boost the economy. So the government basically outsourced this job to 8 private companies. The most famous one was Alibaba's Sesame Credit, but these pilot programs, they just didn't work out the way Beijing hoped. In the end, the government pulled the plug, didn't renew their licenses, and the whole project was just quietly shut down, a failure. Now, this second project was a total free-for-all. Beijing basically told local governments to go build a reputation society, and things got weird. We saw these bizarre, unenforceable rules, like losing points for smoking or gaining points for walking a certain number of steps. Most of these systems were just impractical, nobody liked them, and they got dropped pretty fast after public backlash. But the third project, the government blacklists, this one did have some real teeth. By 2018, 12 million people classified as judgment defaulters had been affected. Now, what does that mean? It's basically people who refuse to pay court-ordered fines, even when they have the money to do so. And this is where those severe punishments, like being banned from buying plane or train tickets, come into play. But the crucial thing to understand here is that these punishments are aimed at a very specific group of people for a very specific offense, not at the general public for how they live their daily lives. And once a defaulter pays up, they're taken right off the list. So the big question is, how did these three totally separate, kind of messy projects get mashed together into this one terrifying unified myth? Well, it turns out it was a perfect storm of misunderstanding, media hype, and some pretty powerful incentives. At its core, the myth was born from one simple but massive mistake.
Journalists basically stitched together the inputs of one system, like the shopping data from the private Sesame credit pilot, with the punishments of a completely separate system, like the travel bans from the government blacklists.
It's almost like a recipe for creating a myth. You take a pretty harmless input, like what you buy online, and you connect it to a really severe but totally unrelated punishment. The story that comes out, buy the wrong video games and you can't travel, is simple, it's terrifying, and it's way more interesting than the complicated reality.
But here's the thing, it wasn't just a media mistake. Chinese companies and even local governments had every reason to hype up their own tech. They wanted to impress their bosses in Beijing, so they threw around all these buzzwords and painted this picture of super advanced systems that, well, they didn't really exist.
And the reality behind all that hype was almost funny. You hear big data and smart cities, and you imagine some futuristic command center, right? Well, the truth was that many of these systems had very, very little actual data on each person. Some of these cutting-edge programs were being run on spreadsheets, or in one case, literally on clipboards. Now, let's be crystal clear. This doesn't mean surveillance in China isn't real. It absolutely is. The key takeaway here is to understand what it actually looks like. It's often more about clunky, inefficient, old-fashioned bureaucracy than it is about the sleek, sci-fi dystopia that we've all been sold. And that really leaves us with one final important question to think about. This whole story is a powerful lesson in media literacy. It shows what happens when one side is ready and willing to believe in a dystopia, and the other side has every reason to exaggerate its own power. The truth? It gets lost somewhere in the middle.